Good day, dear viewers. Today we will talk about the story of Job and the whale in the Bible. Why wouldn't the story be complete without the whale? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Mystery of Job. Have you ever wondered how the story of Job might sound different if it weren't for one mysterious creature from the Bible, the whale? Yes, you heard that right. The whale, whose mentions in sacred texts may seem at first glance unrelated to Job's story, actually plays an important, almost mystical role in understanding profound questions about suffering, faith, and fate. Let's delve into this story. The story of Job is one of the most well-known narratives about human suffering and trials in the Bible. Job was a righteous man, pious and God-fearing, who was blessed with abundant goods. But suddenly, his life fell apart. Losses, illnesses, betrayal by friends, all of this descended upon Job. God allowed Satan to test him to verify the strength of his faith. The question that haunts us from the beginning of this story is, why must the righteous suffer so? Have you ever pondered what lies behind this suffering? Perhaps we can find a clue by paying attention to the image of the whale, which, although not directly mentioned in the story of Job, symbolizes deep and unexplored forces that lie beyond human understanding. The whale, like Job's trial itself, represents something more than just a physical phenomenon. It symbolizes divine intervention, the depth of suffering, and its connection to God's plans. Chapter 2. The whale and ancient seas. Have you ever thought about why the sea and its inhabitants are so often associated with the unknown, the terrifying, and even the supernatural? In the Bible, the sea is not just a physical element of nature. It embodies something much deeper: chaos, the unknown, disorder. But what is the source of this fear of water, and why is it significant for understanding the story of Job? The whale in the Bible is not just an arbitrary symbol. The story of Jonah, who found himself in the belly of a giant sea creature, is perhaps one of the most vivid narratives of divine intervention. But the sea, the whale, and its mysterious depths play an important role in other biblical stories as well. Why? Because water embodies forces that humans cannot control. In the ancient world, the sea was a symbol of chaos, and how often do we feel this chaos in our own lives as we face losses, suffering, and the incomprehensibility of God's plan? For ancient people, the sea was unpredictable and fraught with danger. Have you ever encountered a situation where everything in your life crumbled, and you couldn't find a way out? How is this related to the image of the sea? The sea, its depths, and the whale, all these images symbolize moments when a person loses control, when they find themselves entirely in the hands of divine providence. Just as Jonah was swallowed by the whale, each of us may find ourselves at some point in the dark waters of suffering, unable to comprehend what is happening and why. Let's delve deeper into this symbol. Why is the whale in Jonah's story so important? And how does it help to understand Job's suffering? The thing is, the sea and its inhabitants in ancient cultures were considered to be habitats of chaos and evil. Water has always been associated with something dangerous, with something that eludes human control. It's a force that can destroy everything in its path. Have you ever thought that all of life is like swimming in turbulent waters, where we are trying to stay afloat? When Jonah was cast into the sea and swallowed by the whale, he found himself in a place where no human hand leads, in the belly of a gigantic creature, within the bounds of boundless nature. This was a symbol of complete submission to God's will. Now think about Job. When God allowed Satan to test Job, didn't something similar happen? Job was engulfed by suffering, just as Jonah was by the sea. He did not understand why God allowed this to happen, just as Jonah did not understand why he ended up in the belly of the whale. The question that inevitably arises is, why does God use symbols like the sea, the whale, and suffering to express his will? And how is this related to Job's story? Water and the whale symbolized the complete lack of control on the part of humans. How often in our lives do we encounter situations where we feel helpless? How often do we dive into chaos, where our accustomed methods of coping with problems no longer work? Job, like Jonah, found himself in a situation where his fate was no longer dependent on his own decisions. He, as if swallowed by the sea of suffering, was left alone in the face of incomprehensible divine will. Have you ever felt as if the waves of life were overwhelming you and there was no way to swim back? The whale in Jonah's story and the image of Leviathan in the book of Job symbolize those forces that lie beyond our understanding. These images speak to the fact that a person's life does not always adhere to their will. But could there be something more frightening than the unknown? After all, it is the unknown that makes suffering unbearable. The whale that swallowed Jonah symbolizes the depth and darkness into which a person can plunge, not knowing how it will all end. For Job, such a whale was his suffering, the loss of family, wealth, health. All of this seemed like a series of events devoid of meaning. But isn't that also the nature of our lives? At the moment a person faces unpredictable circumstances, they, like Job, feel as if they are inside the belly of a gigantic monster. Inside the whale, there is no light, no landmarks, only darkness and uncertainty. How often do we, going through tough moments in life, lose our faith and ask ourselves the question, why did this happen to me? The whale, a symbol of the sea's depths and chaos, represents those forces we cannot harness. But it is precisely in such situations that our faith is put to the test. How is this connected to God's providence? In both narratives, both that of Job and Jonah, God uses the symbol of the sea and its inhabitants to show that even in the darkest and most incomprehensible situations for man, he remains close. The whale in Jonah's story is not just a monster, it is an instrument of God's plan. God used the whale to bring Jonah to where he needed to be. Likewise, Job's suffering, akin to a plunge into dark waters, had its purpose, even if Job was not aware of it. Have you ever thought that your suffering could be part of something larger? The whale and the sea in biblical texts remind us that despite the apparent helplessness, God leads us, even when we don't see it. Job did not understand the meaning of his suffering, just as Jonah did not understand why he found himself in the belly of the whale. But ultimately, both realized that their suffering was part of a divine plan. So what is the commonality between Jonah's whale and Job's suffering? Both of these biblical heroes encounter forces they cannot control. Both the whale and the sea symbolize moments when a person is entirely at the mercy of the incomprehensible, when their life transcends logic and the familiar order. Job, like Jonah, is plunged into the marine depths of suffering, but it is precisely at this moment that his faith is tested. The whale, as a symbol of the vast depths of God's plan, helps us to better understand why the story of Job is impossible without these images. How often in life do we find ourselves engulfed by the unknown, incapable of understanding the meaning of what is happening? Have you ever felt as if life is throwing you into a whirlpool of trials, and you can't control anything anymore? Chapter 3. Leviathan, the sea beast. Have you ever tried to imagine the image of Leviathan, the mysterious sea monster that God describes to Job at the end of his sufferings? The question that God asks Job is, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? This powerful image appears in the Bible not by chance. Leviathan, as a symbol, has roots in ancient myths and embodies forces that transcend human understanding. Why did God choose this image to discuss with Job his suffering and fate? How is Leviathan connected to Job's trials, and what does it symbolize? Leviathan is mentioned not only in the book of Job but also in other parts of the Bible, where it is depicted as a powerful sea monster, beyond the control of humans or even other divine beings. In ancient Near Eastern myths, such as those of the Ugaritic people, there exists a similar image of the sea serpent Leviathan, representing chaos. Leviathan is more than just an animal. It is a creature that embodies primal, untamed forces standing in opposition to order and harmony. In ancient cultures, seas and oceans were perceived as embodiments of the unpredictable, dangerous, and hostile world. People were afraid of the unknown depths, and sea monsters like Leviathan symbolized that fear. Within the biblical tradition, Leviathan also represents the forces of chaos that, while controlled by God, remain unmanageable for man. Have you ever felt as though life is throwing a challenge at you that you are utterly powerless to confront? Leviathan represents such a challenge, and God uses this image to communicate an important lesson to Job. In the book of Job, God asks numerous rhetorical questions directed at the main character. Can you bind Leviathan? Can you catch him by the tongue? Can you pierce his nose with a spear? These questions carry deep meaning. God shows Job that there are forces that humans cannot tame or control. Leviathan embodies such forces. It is so powerful and incomprehensible that no person, even the most righteous, can overcome it. The point is that human life is full of things we cannot control or explain. When God speaks to Job about Leviathan, he reminds him, and all of us, that there are events that lie beyond human understanding. Job's suffering, his pain and losses, seem inexplicable to him, just as Leviathan appears unexplainable and incomprehensible. But isn't this the same lesson we learn in life? There are moments when everything around us seems chaotic and uncontrollable, and, like Job, we seek answers. Why is Leviathan so important for understanding Job's suffering? The thing is, Leviathan, as a symbol of chaos, is directly connected to the question of the nature of evil and suffering. God allows the existence of chaos in the world, as seen in the image of Leviathan, but this chaos is controlled. Even at a moment when a person endures deep suffering, like Job, it does not mean that God has left the world to chance. Leviathan symbolizes the trials and burdens that a person cannot avert, but which are in God's hands. Have you ever wondered why the righteous suffer? Why do such terrible calamities as illnesses, losses, and wars exist in a world governed by an all-good God? Leviathan addresses this question. Suffering is part of life, and it resembles a monstrous being against which a person cannot fight. But God helps us understand that even the most powerful forces of evil and chaos are under his control. Leviathan symbolizes the existence of chaos in the world. But it is subject to God's will. When God speaks to Job about Leviathan, he reminds him of his power. Leviathan may be a monster, a symbol of suffering and chaos, but even it is not a threat to God. God asks Job, "Can you handle Leviathan?" Job certainly cannot. But God can. This highlights an important aspect of understanding Job's trials. Human suffering, no matter how deep and uncontrollable it may seem, is within the framework of God's plan. How often do we feel that everything is slipping out of our control? Have you ever thought that your personal Leviathan consists of circumstances you are powerless against? Losses, illnesses, calamities, all these things can appear as forces beyond our control. But God, who created the world and its laws, reminds us through the image of Leviathan that no force can exist outside of his will. Leviathan, like Job's sufferings, serves a purpose that may be incomprehensible to us, but is known and understood only by God. Leviathan, as a symbol of chaos, helps Job and us to grasp the boundary between human understanding and divine purpose. Through the images of Leviathan, God shows Job that there are forces against which a person is powerless. Even though Job is righteous, that does not mean he can avoid suffering or control every circumstance in his life. Leviathan reminds us that there is something greater than human reason, and that not everything in this world is subject to our desires and understanding. But God provides Job, and all of us, with comfort. He reminds us that even Leviathan, with all its power, is governed by him. No trials, no forces of evil or chaos can exist outside of God's control. Job's sufferings, like Leviathan, are part of a plan that we may not always be aware of. Ultimately, Leviathan becomes a symbol of all the trials a person faces in their life. It is an image that speaks to the fact that the world is full of mysteries that are beyond human understanding and control. Job's suffering is akin to battling Leviathan. It is relentless, destructive, and incomprehensible. Yet, just as Leviathan is not a threat to God, neither are Job's sufferings, no matter how heavy they may be. Outside of God's plan, Job could not conquer Leviathan, just as he could not understand the reasons for his suffering. But God reminds him that everything is in his hands. Leviathan, a symbol of chaos and unyielding suffering, serves as an illustration that the world is full of mysteries that are beyond human grasp. But the most important thing is that Leviathan, however frightening it may be, is still governed by God's hand. Chapter 4, Job and the Mystery of Divine Silence. Have you ever wondered why God remained silent during most of Job's suffering? What is it like to cry into the void, to ask questions, to demand explanations, only to receive silence in return? How often do we encounter situations in life where it seems that God has left us in our time of need? This chapter raises one of the deepest and most troubling questions in the book of Job. Why does God remain silent when a person is suffering? Job is a righteous man, someone who has strived to live according to God's laws throughout his life, devoted and pious. Suddenly, his world collapses. He loses everything: his children, his possessions, his health. He experiences suffering that he cannot explain. He cries out to God, asks questions, seeks comfort, but instead, he is met with silence. Why does God remain silent at this moment? Why does he not come to Job with an explanation when Job needs him the most? Have you ever asked yourself whether God's silence might also be a test? In the book of Job, divine silence becomes part of a deeper process of testing faith. How often do we face situations in our lives when it seems that God has abandoned us? We ask questions: why is this happening? Where are you, Lord? Why are you silent when I need you? Job, sitting among his friends, covered in sores, in utter poverty and loneliness, asked these questions too. God's silence, despite its apparent harshness, may be a form of education. It is an invitation to reflection, to seek answers not in external circumstances but within our inner world. Often in difficult moments, we expect God to immediately reveal His presence and provide explanations, but this does not always happen. God's silence may serve to compel us to think more deeply, to see reality outside of familiar categories. Perhaps this silence is the moment when a person must find meaning amidst their pain and suffering. Do you know the feeling of being in a dead end, with the exit hidden from you? Job felt this way. His world was literally crumbling before his eyes. His friends came to him, trying to explain that suffering is a punishment for sins, even though Job knew he did not deserve such punishment. In this atmosphere of disappointment and despair, God's silence only intensified his suffering. But isn't this a metaphor for life? We expect God to always be near us when we are suffering, yet His silence often serves as a test of our faith and patience. Expectancy and patience are the lessons Job had to learn during his suffering. God's silence does not mean that He has abandoned Job. It does not mean that God has forgotten him. God is silent because it is important for Job to go through this process of inner purification. To struggle with doubts, to ask questions and seek answers, in order eventually to realize something greater about the nature of God and human existence. This is not an instant answer, nor quick comfort. It is a long journey that requires patience. Have you ever thought that God's silence might be not only a punishment but also an opportunity? An opportunity for what? An opportunity for self-discovery. When God is silent, a person finds themselves alone with their thoughts, doubts, and fears. Job, in his suffering, begins to ask questions he might never have considered during more prosperous times. What are those questions? He starts to reflect on his life, on his righteousness, on why what has happened to him has happened. God's silence opens a space for deep self-exploration for Job. A person faced with trials begins to seek answers within themselves. Why am I suffering? What is my fault? What is the meaning of all that is happening? These are questions Job asks not only to God but also to himself. God's silence invites Job to look at himself from a different perspective, to reassess his relationship with God, and to understand that righteousness does not guarantee immunity from suffering. Have you ever considered that silence can be a form of communication? God, remaining silent in Job's sufferings, gives him the chance to seek the truth on his own, to understand the world and his own soul. This is a unique form of education that requires courage and humility in the face of the unknown. When God finally spoke to Job, did he provide him with specific answers to his questions about the meaning of suffering? No, God did not explain to Job why he underwent such trials. Instead, he posed questions that made Job aware of his place in the world. Have you ever tried to grasp the complexity and vastness of divine plans? God is not obligated to explain every detail of what is happening in the world to us. God's silence teaches us humility in face of the mystery of divine design. Job sought specific answers to his suffering but received not explanations but a revelation of the incomprehensibility of God. This revelation transformed his worldview. The God who created Leviathan, oceans, and stars, who governs the entire universe, may not explain to every person the reason for their suffering. Not because he is cruel or indifferent, but because the human mind cannot grasp everything. Isn't this a lesson for each of us? God is silent because human suffering cannot always be explained within the limits of our understanding. Sometimes we must accept that there are things we may never fully comprehend. Like Leviathan, suffering can be too complex for us to fathom, but that does not mean it lacks meaning. Have you ever thought that the greatest test of faith is God's silence? Silence is not the absence of love or care. On the contrary, it is a form of communication that tests us. God's silence compels us to continue believing even when we do not see or hear him. Job found himself at a crossroads. His faith was put to the ultimate test when God did not answer his pleas. This moment of testing is the culmination of the entire book of Job. God's silence tests not just his loyalty but the very essence of his faith. It is easy to believe in God when everything is going well. But what is it like to believe when everything is falling apart and God provides no explanations? Silence forces Job to contemplate what it means to have faith when all familiar notions of life collapse. God's silence in the story of Job leads to the main lesson: a person must learn to accept suffering even without understanding its reasons. In the end, Job realizes that his suffering is part of a greater plan, which he cannot comprehend. But this does not mean that God has forgotten him. On the contrary, it is precisely in silence that God is present with Job, helping him strengthen his faith and gain new understanding of life and his place in it. Have you ever considered that silence can teach us humility and patience? God's silence became a moment of renewal for Job. When God finally spoke, Job did not receive the answers he had expected, but he received something far more important: the understanding that faith in God does not require complete explanations. Faith is trust even when we do not understand and cannot hear. God's silence in Job's story is one of the most profound and mysterious messages in the Bible. It compels us to ask ourselves, can we continue to believe when God is silent? Can we trust him even if we do not receive answers to our questions? Job showed that it is possible. His story teaches us that God's silence is not the absence of his presence but a way to allow us to grow in faith and recognize our dependence on him. God's silence is a space for deep reflection, seeking, and renewal. Chapter 5, Light on the Horizon. Have you ever contemplated what it feels like, the moment when, after long suffering and painful questions, light suddenly appears on the horizon? What happens in a person's soul when, after a long night of sorrow and hopelessness, they finally catch the first glimmer of hope? In Job's life, this light does not come immediately, but its emergence marks the climax of the entire story, the discovery of the meaning of suffering and a return to life. But what does this light represent? It is not merely the end of suffering or the restoration of losses. It signifies something much deeper, a new understanding of oneself, the world, and God. The light that Job sees at the end of his path symbolizes spiritual rebirth, a new awareness of what it means to live and suffer in a world governed by divine providence. Many of us have experienced periods in life when darkness seemed to engulf us from all sides. But have you noticed how, with the appearance of the first rays of light, not only does the world change, but so does your inner state? Psychologically and spiritually, this moment transitions from despair to hope. For Job, the shift from darkness to light was possible only when he accepted his inability to understand the entirety of God's plan and humbled himself before the mystery. The darkness in Job's life symbolizes not only his physical suffering but also his inner struggle with questions for which he could find no answers. Job anticipated that God would provide an explanation for his calamities. But instead, God revealed the grandeur of his creation and powers that transcend human understanding. Job came to realize that his pain, much like Leviathan, is part of this vast world. This transition to humility before the incomprehensible becomes the beginning of light on his horizon. When God finally spoke to Job, it was a moment not so much of response as of revelation. Have you ever found yourself in a state where unexpected answers or insights come not from direct explanations but through profound awareness? God did not give Job detailed explanations for the reasons for his suffering. Instead, he showed him the grandeur of the world, creating images of Leviathan, Behemoth, and nature governed by his will. Job realized that his suffering was part of a plan that transcends human intellect. This realization, this revelation, is the light that begins to rise on the horizon of his life. Job understands that he is not the center of the universe and that his suffering is not punishment but a trial through which he has learned of God's greatness. Have you ever attempted to come to terms with the thought that life does not always provide answers to every question? This is the moment of Job's revelation. He stops demanding explanations and finds peace within himself by accepting his role in the great divine creation. The light on the horizon in Job's story also symbolizes his return to life. However, it is not simply the restoration of his wealth and health, it is the rebirth of his faith and hope. When God restores to Job all that he has lost, it does not mean that his former life returns exactly as it was. On the contrary, Job becomes a different person. He becomes someone who has walked through the fire of suffering and gained a new, deeper faith. This moment of return to life is not just about forgiveness and restoration, it is also a reward for perseverance. God did not abandon Job but allowed him to go through the darkness to show that true light comes when a person learns to trust God even when they cannot see the meaning in their suffering. Have you ever experienced a moment when, after prolonged trials, you felt that your life was changing not only externally but also internally? Job does not simply regain his blessings, he receives a new perspective on life, a new meaning for existence. The light on the horizon for him is not just the end of suffering, it is a new beginning. One of the most important aspects of the light on the horizon in Job's story is the new understanding of God and the world. Have you ever felt that after trials your relationship with life and God has changed? Before his suffering, Job was confident in his righteousness and believed that he understood the world and God's laws. But after everything he has endured, his understanding has changed. Now he knows that God is not merely a judge punishing for sins and rewarding for righteousness. God is a creator whose ways and designs are inscrutable. Job realizes that his suffering was part of a great but incomprehensible plan. He understands that his righteousness does not protect him from trials, but it also does not mean that God has turned away from him. This new understanding of God as an unfathomable yet loving creator becomes for Job a source of new light and inner peace. The moment when light appears on the horizon is also connected to Job's restoration of inner peace. The suffering he endured shattered his internal world, leaving him devoid of security and stability. But after he acknowledges the grandeur of God's plan and accepts his limitations, his soul finds rest. Now he knows that even when everything seems meaningless and unjust, God's will is always present and governs the world. Have you ever felt that after long searching, you finally found peace? When the light begins to rise on Job's horizon, it represents not only physical restoration but also spiritual renewal. His soul, wearied by suffering in the search for answers, finds peace in accepting God's will. This inner peace becomes the foundation for his future life. The light on the horizon in Job's story also symbolizes hope. Hope is what sustains us during life's darkest moments. It remained with Job even when he stood on the brink of despair. Perhaps he did not always realize it, but somewhere deep within him, there remained faith that God would not abandon him. And this faith, despite all trials, led him to the light. Have you ever felt that hope is the one thing that keeps you afloat during life's storms? In Job's life, hope did not fade, and when God finally spoke to him, the light of hope illuminated his life. It was not an instantaneous miracle or magical resolution of all problems. It was a long process in which hope and faith in God proved stronger than suffering. The light on the horizon in Job's story is not merely a symbol of the end of his sufferings. It represents a profound shift in his understanding of himself, God, and the world. Job traversed darkness to see this light, and in this light, he discovered not only his well-being but also a new, deeper meaning in life. This light is a symbol of hope, faith, and inner peace that can be reborn even after the most severe trials. The story of Job reminds each of us that even when life seems immersed in darkness, light is always on the horizon. We may not see it immediately, but if we trust God, that light will surely appear, bringing with it new understanding and strength for the journey ahead. Chapter 6, The Divine Plan. Have you ever wondered if every situation in life, even the most difficult ones, might have a hidden meaning? Why does it sometimes seem that God has abandoned us, when perhaps He is closer than ever in those moments? The book of Job reveals one of the deepest questions of human existence. What is God's plan, and why are suffering and hardship an integral part of this great design? The story of Job is not merely a tale of suffering and reward, it is a revelation of God's plan that can never be fully comprehended but encompasses all aspects of life. This plan, sometimes mysterious and seemingly unjust, plays a central role in Job's understanding, spiritual transformation, and rebirth. Have you ever asked why God allows suffering? In every person's life, there are moments of pain and trials that seem to have no explanation or meaning. Job experienced this as well. Before his suffering, he was a righteous man who obeyed all laws and commandments. Yet, his righteousness did not protect him from sudden and painful losses. Why did God allow this? Why was Job chosen for such a difficult trial? In the context of God's plan, suffering is not punishment but a component of a deeper design. The book of Job addresses the theme of faith being tested through suffering, which, despite its harshness and pain, can serve as a means for spiritual growth and understanding. God's plan includes suffering as a pathway to a deeper knowledge of God and one's own essence. Job's suffering was not in vain. It not only tested his faith but also opened new horizons of understanding and humility before God's will. Have you considered that even in moments when everything seems meaningless and unfair, there might be a plan that we simply cannot see? This design, although hidden from human eyes, operates throughout our lives, and suffering can be an important part of it. One of the key moments in the book of Job is his dialogue with God. In his suffering, Job demanded answers. Why do I suffer? What have I done to deserve this? He expected logical explanations and direct responses. Isn't that what we do when we encounter confusion? We ask God to explain the reasons for our pain. We yearn to understand how our personal tragedy fits into a larger plan, but God's response is astonishing and paradoxical. He does not give Job direct explanations. Instead, he poses questions that make Job realize how limited human understanding is. God speaks of the greatness of his creation, about the stars, animals, the elements, and the Leviathan, symbols of how little humanity comprehends the world. Have you ever noticed how life sometimes poses questions that force us to pause and reflect on things that are beyond our grasp? Through his silence and questions, God shows Job that human understanding is too narrow to encompass the entirety of God's plan. What we perceive as suffering and injustice may be part of a greater order that we are unable to see from our limited perspective. The story of Job teaches us that there is an insurmountable distance between God's plan and human understanding. Have you ever felt that some things in life are simply impossible to explain? Perhaps you have experienced moments when every attempt to understand why something happened ends in a dead end. This is the encounter with the mystery of God's plan. Job, having endured terrible trials, tried to make sense of them from a human perspective. His friends, who came to comfort him, offered their explanations, attempting to reduce suffering to moral and ethical lessons. They argued that God is just, and if Job is suffering, it means he has sinned. However, this human explanation proved too narrow to grasp the full scope of God's plan. God reveals to Job that his suffering was not a result of sin but part of a more complex and profound design. Have you ever considered that some aspects of your life may be part of God's plan that defies logical explanation? Job realized that his suffering, despite its inexplicability, held significance and was part of a plan beyond his comprehension. Accepting God's plan is one of the most difficult lessons Job learns in his life. We all strive to control our destiny, explain the events around us, and seek answers to questions we deem important. But God's plan is something greater than just a design that can be understood or predicted. It is an eternal and universal order, where every detail, even suffering, has its meaning. After a long search for answers, Job accepts the fact that God's plan remains a mystery, and that his understanding is limited. This moment of acceptance marks the beginning of his inner healing. Job stops asking, "Why?" and starts trusting God, realizing that despite his suffering, God remains good and merciful. Have you ever faced moments when the answers you sought never came, but you gained the insight that some things simply need to be accepted? Accepting God's plan is an act of profound faith. It is the belief that God sees everything, even what remains hidden from us. Job concludes his journey, realizing that God's plan exists beyond his understanding. But this does not make it any less real. His suffering had a purpose, even if he couldn't see it at first. Job acknowledges that the greatness of God's creation transcends human reason, and in this recognition, he finds peace. The final lesson from the book of Job is that we, as humans, may not understand everything that occurs around us. But this does not mean that God's plan is absent or that our suffering is meaningless. On the contrary, God's plan operates through all aspects of our lives, even when we are unaware of it. This requires us to have faith, trust, and humility before the grand mystery of the Creator. The divine plan described in the story of Job is not just a chain of coincidences or punishments. It is a profound design that encompasses both joy and suffering, order and chaos. Chapter 7. Conclusion. The whale and humanity. Have you ever thought that the whale in the Bible might be more than just a symbol of a colossal creature? What if its role extends beyond a literal presence in the text and bears a deeper spiritual significance? In this final chapter, we will tie together all the elements of the story of Job and try to understand why its narrative would be incomplete without the symbolism of the whale, or Leviathan, as it is sometimes called. The whale, as part of biblical mythology, symbolizes something greater than mere power or the destructive forces of nature. It represents untamed chaos, mystery, and simultaneously stands as a testimony to the greatness of God's design, which includes both order and elements beyond human control. This animal embodies exactly the aspects of life that Job faced: the boundless forces of nature, the horror of misunderstanding, and the power of humility. Have you ever felt so small before the vast power of nature that you experienced both fear and awe simultaneously? In the Old Testament, the whale, as well as Leviathan, plays the role of a symbol of this incomprehensible force. It is a mysterious and terrifying creature that humanity cannot tame or domesticate. For Job, encountering such an image becomes the embodiment of his own confrontation with something he cannot comprehend, his own suffering. God's will, and the unrecognizable plan, the whale represents chaos and magnificence simultaneously. It symbolizes a world that, despite its enigma and sometimes terrifying nature, is part of a unified design. In this sense, the whale embodies that aspect of God's creation that humanity will never fully control or understand. Just as Job faced the incomprehensible, the Leviathan, the whale in the realm of symbols, so each of us encounters hardships that defy logical explanation. The whale in this story reminds us that God's world is not only order but also mystery, chaos that transcends our understanding. It teaches us that it may be futile to try to tame every element of life or find an answer to every question. Some things simply need to be accepted as part of the great and secret divine plan. Have you ever wondered why suffering feels so unbearable? Why does it provoke questions that rarely receive straightforward answers? The whale, much like Job's suffering, symbolizes something immense and powerful that can consume and simultaneously make a person feel insignificant. In this regard, suffering and the image of the whale intersect. Both represent forces that cannot be controlled but must be accepted. For Job, suffering was that whale that engulfed his life, turned everything upside down, and made him question justice and the meaning of life. The whale, like a storm before which a person is powerless, symbolizes that inevitable and unpredictable element of life. However, as with Job, the key is not to conquer suffering or eradicate it but to find a way through it, maintaining faith and hope for divine understanding. Have you ever contemplated what your role is in a world where suffering is inevitable? The whale in Job's story signifies both destruction and rebirth, loss and new life. Job's suffering, like his encounter with Leviathan, forced him to accept that some things in life will never be fully explained. Suffering can become a means of purification, transformation, and spiritual growth, if we embrace it, like Job, and allow ourselves to see the light beyond the horizon of pain. What does it mean to submit to God's will? The whale, as a symbol of untamed force, teaches us an important lesson. Not everything in life is within our control, and not everything can be explained through logic and human understanding. Humility is the acknowledgement that our minds are limited, and that we cannot always grasp the complexity of God's creation. The whale in the story of Job serves as a reminder that there are forces that exceed our capacity. Just as Job had to recognize his limitations and submit to God's greatness, so does every person face moments when one must accept the incomprehensible. Leviathan, the whale, chaos, all of these remind us that our world is far broader and more complex than we can imagine. It is in this awareness that true humility begins. Perhaps the whale embodies that part of God's plan which humanity will never grasp, and it is precisely this role that it plays in Job's narrative. Job's humility before the mystery of God's design became a step toward renewal, a new beginning, and this lesson is relevant for all of us. Have you ever felt that through suffering, one can come to a new understanding of God? The whale in Job's story, like his suffering, serves an important function. It acts as a bridge between humanity and the incomprehensible God. Once Job recognizes his limitations before the grandeur of Leviathan and God's creation, he begins to understand his connection to the Creator on a deeper level. In this sense, the whale becomes a symbol not only of fear and the majesty of nature but also of the opportunity for humanity to transcend its mortal limitations and reach out to the mystery of God's plan. Just as the fish in the story of Jonah became a means of salvation and awareness, so Leviathan for Job became a symbol of his spiritual rebirth through suffering. The whale here is not merely a force of destruction but also a force of salvation, for through its encounter with humanity, one comes to realize their place in the world. Have you ever felt that the difficulties you are experiencing help you get closer to understanding the deeper aspects of life and God? The whale, as a symbol of this process, becomes an important element of Job's spiritual growth, helping him see God's plan in all its fullness. The story of Job, which includes Leviathan, is not just a tale of suffering and reward. It is a profound meditation on humanity's place in the world, our connection to God's plan, and how through suffering, one can find a new meaning in life. The whale is the element that helps us realize our insignificance and simultaneously the greatness of our purpose. Have you ever pondered what your path is in this vast world where the forces of nature and God's design intertwine into a whole? The whale in Job's story serves as a reminder that even the most terrifying and mysterious elements of life can become sources of knowledge and strength. Job, having endured suffering, accepts his role in the grand creation and finds peace and humility before God's will. The whale in the story of Job is more than merely a symbol of power. It represents an unresolved mystery of God's plan, a force that connects chaos and order, suffering and rebirth. Through the image of Leviathan, Job and we, as readers, learn to accept that there are elements in the world that will never be fully understood or controlled. However, as Job's story shows, accepting these mysteries and submitting to God's plan does not lead to despair. On the contrary, it opens the path to a new understanding of oneself, the world, and God. Ultimately, the whale becomes a symbol of that mystery, which, although remaining incomprehensible, leads to the realization of deeper truths. In this understanding lies our strength, much like Job's strength, in a world filled with both suffering and the light on the horizon. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support it with a like and a comment. I would be very grateful.